This took place 2 years ago. I'd recently turned 19, and I was a freshman in college and was going to school in a small town in South Louisiana. My parents were the pull yourself up by your bootstraps type, having done their best to instill a strong work ethic in me growing up. They'd expected me to pay for my own tuition with no help from them whatsoever. Not gonna lie, I was a little annoyed at first. I didn't mind paying my own way, but I was concerned about the impact working all those hours would have on my social life, as I wanted the full college experience. I started working part-time as a waiter at a local seafood restaurant. Shifts were limited and tips were scarce. My dad recommended supplementing my income through yard work, saying I could use his riding lawnmower and leaf blower. Anyway, I started making pretty good money on mowing lawns, managing to snag a few regular clients through word of mouth. My best friend Blaze was working as a cashier at the local corner store, while he attended nearby community college. He'd happily recommended my lawn care services to any customers or coworkers. I was ecstatic. I was not only making enough money to pay for school, but I even had a little left over to get my beat up old truck some much needed repairs. Blaze told me about a guy he worked with at the store. It was a slightly older guy, mid-20s I believe, and his name was Alex. He was quiet, didn't smile much, and a bit of a loner. Didn't really matter to me, I was only looking to make some cash. He'd said the guy needed someone to mow his front and backyard, as he really didn't have the time. But he didn't elaborate as to what he did outside of working at the grocery store. But I guessed it wasn't much. So my friend Blaze gave Alex my number. No big deal, right? After all, I was giving it out to anyone who might be even the least bit interested in my services. Turned out, this was the start to what would be a year-long nightmare. He texted me on a Saturday morning, the day after Blaze and I had talked. It was pretty cordial and simple, nothing more than a,
"Hey man, what's up? Your friend Blaze told me you cut grass?"
I gave an affirmative, and then asked when he'd like me to come over and how frequently, given how often it rained here in South Louisiana. He simply told me to come later that day, and he wasn't sure if he could afford me on a weekly basis. Whatever, I thought. Maybe we could work out some kind of arrangement. I immediately hopped out of bed, got dressed, and drove to where he lived, which was located on the far side of town across the bayou. His house wasn't located in the nicest of neighborhoods. Many of the houses were run down, seemingly in a state of disrepair. The yards were thick with grass, knee-high length if I remember correctly. I don't think any of those people could afford to pay me even a quarter of what I'd charged at the time, which wasn't much at around $45. I finally made my way over to his house, which didn't look all that bad compared to the others. Horizontal siding, painted a soft blue pastel, sat atop a dark gray brick, with cracked bay windows in the front. I parked my truck on the side of the street and shot him a text stating that I'd arrived. He came out of the house in a wrinkled t-shirt and pajama pants, looking as if he'd just woken up. "Hey," I said, smiling as I usually do. "Rough night?" I said jokingly. He didn't respond, just blinked and ran his right hand through his tousled dark blonde hair for what felt like an eternity, but realistically could only have been less than a minute. We both just stood there, in complete silence. His dark green eyes bore into me. I averted my gaze, catching sight of fallen branches that had broken off a large oak tree in his front yard. We had just been hit by a hurricane a few days earlier. "So how'd you guys weather the storm?" I asked, my eyes affixed to the broken branches and scattered leaves. He simply shrugged and said, "Okay." Then it occurred to me that maybe I was speaking to the wrong person. "You're Alex, right? You work with Blaze at the village market?" He nodded. What the fuck was this guy's deal? I thought, and just kept smiling, as I always did when I got nervous. I told him I had a lot of clients to get to that day and that I better get started soon. He nodded again and pointed to the backyard gate on the side of the house. He started walking and I followed. It was a sizable backyard. Children's toys scattered almost everywhere. There was a cluttered tool shed next to a fence far off to the left. I did my best to hide my disgust as I nearly stepped in some dog shit. It was weird. Backyard was like a minefield of dog shit, yet no dog to be found. I brushed that thought away and just went to work. He didn't bother me or really interact with me at all that day. He'd seemed really friendly via text, so I just chalked it up to being socially awkward like Blaze said. He paid me once I finished mowing his lawn, and then I went on my way. Later that night he texted me again and apologized for how he'd been acting, saying he was tired from the night before. He wasn't sleeping well and under a lot of stress. I replied and told him I completely understood and asked if he needed me again next week. He ignored that question and asked if I could suggest anything from Pelicans on the Bayou, the restaurant where I'd been working. At first, I was a little taken aback by the question, as I wasn't sure how he knew I worked there. But then, it occurred to me that Blaze must have told him. I then recommended the battered chicken wings, and he thanked me. We started to text back and forth for the next few days. He'd ask me questions about my life, nothing too personal. He would, however, make inappropriate jokes, but nothing I couldn't handle. Seemed like a pretty cool guy when we texted. Strangely, most of our conversations happened late at night, or in the early morning hours on weekends. Again, I didn't mind. He was a paying customer and I was a friendly guy. About a month had passed when my friend Blaze had sent me the screenshot of the text he'd received from Alex. It was supposedly a text sent by me saying all sorts of horrible things to him, like he was a fucking loser who never gets laid and needed help getting a real job. Shit like that. I couldn't believe what I was reading. In the fake text, he even threw in some homophobic slurs, which offended me greatly since I have a gay uncle that I'm really close to. I then decided it's best to just ignore him. This guy was clearly unwell, trying to start shit with someone he barely even knew. He then texted me a few days later, acting as if he'd never done anything wrong. The text kept coming. He chatted with me like we were longtime friends, and my patience grew very thin. I finally snapped and messaged him back. Dude, I know what you did. If you know what's best for you, you'll leave me be. He feigned ignorance at first, then proceeded to apologize profusely. At this point, I really didn't care. I don't know this guy at all. He was nothing to me. I was busy with school and work and had absolutely no time for any of this drama. I blocked his number and thought it was over, but I couldn't have been more wrong. A few weeks later, I received another text, this time from a completely different number. And it was Alex again, with more apologies. I then blocked that number. I figured he'd finally take the hint and leave me alone. He didn't. He then added me on Snapchat using a fake profile. I accepted this request. The name looked familiar, so I thought nothing of it. He asked me if I still worked at Pelicans. I told him I didn't, as they kept cutting my hours. He then asked if I was still cutting grass. I told him that I was, but only for close friends and family members, as I had a bad experience with a former client. He then proceeded to ask me the details, but by then, I figured out who it was. I told him to leave me alone, and if he didn't, I was going to call the police. I then got a text from my girlfriend at the time, asking if I knew a guy named Troy. He supposedly saw me cheating with another girl at some party. I told her everything that was going on. Sure, she wasn't going to believe me, as I did have a history of playing the field. I told her that I was completely faithful to her, and that this guy, Alex/Troy, was fucking nuts. She told me to start collecting evidence, take screenshots of text, and that's exactly what I started doing. Most of the texts were pretty benign, just more of him asking for forgiveness. Then late one Saturday night, he sent me another text. This time it was a picture of my house. I was drinking with a few buddies of mine at the time, Blaze included. I immediately showed him that text, and he suggested we call the cops. Some of my more aggressive friends suggest we go outside and beat his ass. I wasn't really sure what to do. Didn't really want to get the cops involved, but I certainly didn't want to go outside not knowing if he had a weapon of some kind. I told everyone to stay in the house and not to do anything. I peeked through the blinds and saw nothing. He couldn't have been there for very long. He must have left as soon as he'd taken that picture. I didn't hear from him for a few weeks. Blaze, along with the other 2 cashiers, asked to not work the same shift with him. And I was hoping it was finally over. Maybe he'd moved on to someone else. Then, on a cold, early October evening, I came home from my last class to find my mother shaking. I'd never seen her like that before, and I asked her what was wrong. She was speechless, trembling almost. She showed me what she'd found lying on our front porch. It was a large manila envelope with Instagram pictures of me, with my eyes scratched out and red X's drawn on my face. A chill went down my spine. I don't think I'd ever been so afraid in my life. Like I'd never known real fear up until that point. My mom insisted that we go to the police, and I agreed. She ended up talking to a close family friend who knew the sheriff. A couple of officers came to the house, took our statements, and told us that if Alex ever came by again, to call them immediately. I didn't hear from Alex ever again after that. He was later fired from the grocery store. The owner caught him stealing from the register. Life went on. Months went by, and I felt like I could finally breathe again. One day, while running errands for my mom, I saw him, standing on the side of the road. He was holding up a cardboard sign asking for money. He locked eyes with me. They were cold, emotionless, and I could feel that familiar shiver creeping up my spine. It was as if everything had come to a complete standstill. After I regained my senses, I sped off, hoping that that would be the last time I ever saw him again.
One sunny warm day, about 1.5 years ago, I was hanging out at this little park. This park was located in the center of one of our small, historic townships, right on the main street. The park had a small playground with a swing set and a mini jungle gym with a slide. There were also public restrooms and an old brick jailhouse for like 2 people from back in the day, plus a large gazebo with a couple of metal benches. The gazebo is located right next to the center of the park, which is where I was sitting while embroidering. Separated by a small road that led to the park's parking lot, there was a historic 2-story building. Outside the back of the building, a massive deconstruction and cleanup project was underway. I could clearly see what was going on from my position at the gazebo steps where I was sitting. On the first day of the cleanup process, I noticed that the only dude left working there for the day seemed to keep staring over at me. At that time though, I really didn't think much of it. However, the next day, I also noticed the same dude seeming to stare over at me once in a while. As he was finishing up the day, a friend that I was talking to at the gazebo decided to head over and ask dude what was going on over there. As a result, the dude eventually worked his way over to the gazebo with my friend. They talked for a little bit, but the dude lingered behind me, even though my friend had to leave. Our conversation was pretty basic, just idle chit-chat, you know, polite but distant sort of stuff. Like stuff about recent weather, nothing deep. As we were talking, he noticed that I smoked when I opened up my sewing box. Politely apologizing, he asked if I could smoke a little with him, so he didn't have to get up and walk to his car to grab some of his. I knew that he was just tired from a long day's worth of physical labor, so I understood. But unfortunately I told him I was out myself at the moment. So he suggested we both walk back to his car to smoke. Hesitantly, I decided to walk to his car with him. We were out in broad daylight in public, after all. But when we get to his car, and he had a quick glance inside, he realized that he had forgot his smokes wherever he was staying. As he turned his back to me from his car, I noticed him suddenly looking around, as though maybe he was looking for someone. What the fuck? I questioned. He then told me a rather lengthy story about how he was being stalked by a gang. He said that it has been going on for a couple years at this point. That made me a little nervous, as his whole demeanor had seemed to change since telling me the story. So, trying to change the subject, he suggested that we would go to where he was staying to smoke. He said that it was only like 5 minutes away from the park. I declined politely, making up a lie about me having a ride coming for me at any time, but he tried pressing me more about it, emphasizing that it's practically just down the street. He said it got kinda lonely there, and that it would be really nice to have some company over. I once again politely refused his invitation, which seemed to frustrate him a little. As he was still trying to talk me into it, I noticed that he had been leaning against his car with one arm on it as he was standing in front of me. I had put my back to the car, but it didn't really start to bother me until he put his other hand on the other side of me, sort of trapping me there. I quickly ducked under his arm and stood more freely a few inches over. Right after I moved away slightly, he got into the door panel of his car and pulled out a large hunting knife. He must have seen the shocked look on my face because he sort of laughed a little and explained that it was for any potential gang members that may have been watching him at the time. I didn't quite know how to respond to that. At that moment, I started to think about how I have a good friend who just lived on the other side of the park in a small apartment building, but I knew that dude would have easily watched me walk over there and could have potentially waited for me to come back out to leave. So I started to make an excuse that I should be heading on right then, and he should go home and relax and smoke, and I'm sorry that I couldn't go with him. I really just didn't want to piss him off right then. Just as I was about to open my mouth to finish making my polite excuse, he stepped over the front of me and blocked me in with his arms again. "Come on," he pleaded with me. "Just come back to my place for a bit, and we can hang out and smoke." He reiterated once again that it was only like a 5-minute drive. At this point though, I was done making excuses to this dude. I had already made it crystal clear that I was not going anywhere with him. It was then that he pulled out a knife from his pocket, through gritted teeth, trying to mask his frustration. He said, "Look, I'm just a little lonely is all." He leaned in close to my face, and I could clearly see the yellowing, crooked teeth barely inches away. "I won't be keeping you long," he hissed in my face. At that point, I really started panicking internally. I froze, not knowing what to say. But then, thank all sorts of goodness for another friend of mine who suddenly appeared calling my name as he approached us. "What's up?" he asked, walking up to us at the car. This seemed to do the trick, as the dude put his arm down and turned to face my friend. Upon releasing me from his dominance, the dude seemed to politely introduce himself to my friend. His whole demeanor had suddenly went back to normal. So, as politely as I could manage, I started a casual conversation with my friend, and we began slowly to walk away from the creepy dude together. We left that scary situation behind. I never did see that dude again, thankfully, but I did avoid going back to that park for at least a few weeks after the incident. So creepy, encroaching construction dude who was being stalked by a gang and tried taking me out of public view for whatever scary reason. Let's not meet ever again, please. So when I was 9 years old, I lived in Mexico, and let's just say it wasn't a particularly peaceful year when it came to crime. At that point, I was living with just my mom in my childhood home, up in the mountains near a forest, which I absolutely loved my home since I was a big fan of nature. One night, I woke up from an absolutely horrible nightmare and quickly made my way to my mom's room to wake her because I was so panicked. After I stopped crying, I got into bed with her. And as we were falling asleep, I told her I didn't want to live in the house anymore. And all my mom said was, "I promise, this is the last night you have to sleep in this house." And that was a haunting promise that was kept. We were woken up while it was still dark out by my dog barking nonstop outside. My mom got out of the bed grumbling about him being so loud that early in the morning and made her way to the front door that led to the front garden where my dog was yapping away. We had an alarm system on the doors and windows, so I just heard my mom deactivate it in order to check what was going on with our dog. I was still laying in my bed because I was cold and it was still too early to get out of bed when suddenly I heard my mom scream, which caused me to stand up and call for her. Not even 30 seconds later, a man dressed in fully black and wearing a balaclava came into the room and told me to get dressed, and I quickly did as I was told. They took me into the living room where two men, dressed exactly the same as the man who had got me, had my mom with a bandage over her eyes. I just remember begging the three men to leave us alone and telling them where her wallet and valuables were. But one of them just said, "That's not why we're here." They proceeded to put pillowcases over our heads and shoved us into the trunk of our car. After this, the rest of the events were a bit fuzzy, since it was hard to tell time and our sight was so limited. They hid us somewhere in the forest, hidden behind a rock wall on a bed mattress. I can't really say how long we were there, and I have vague memories of one of the men's back that I caught a glimpse of when I peeked under the pillowcase. All my mother did was pray nonstop. 1, because she truly believed in God, but 2, because Mexicans are extremely religious and it might just sway them from killing a mother and a child. After being moved to another location, inside a seemingly abandoned house, they called my family to ask for a ransom. We couldn't really hear most of the conversation, but the man we nicknamed the Mean One felt the need to tell me that my father didn't love me and that they were going to send him a few of my fingers if he didn't pay up. Shortly after, we were loaded into another car, where my mom started begging one of the men not to kill us. They drove us around for what felt like hours until suddenly they stopped, dragged us out, and told us to get on our knees. At this point, my mother was certain that we were going to get shot, so she asked if they did, to shoot me first, in order for me not to hear my own mother die. The men said nothing, and we abruptly heard the car peel out, and my mother just screamed at me to run as fast as I could. We ran for a few minutes, and then we saw a residential area, where we started frantically knocking on doors, hoping that the kidnappers didn't plan on coming back for us. To our desperation, no one in the first 2 houses opened their door, when suddenly an old man opened up at the 3rd house, and after trying to explain to him, and seeing the state that we were in, he let us come in to call my father. After he picked up the phone, all I could do was cry after hearing his voice. He came to get us that night, and that was the first time I ever saw my father cry.
I'm a 42-year-old male, and I live just outside of Portland. I love going out on my own to have a beer and play pinball. And I have an app on my phone that displays the locations of any pinball machines around me, and I use it to wander around the city a lot before the pandemic, crawling between bars and playing pinball in each one. I'm married, but loud bars and pinball machines are not comfortable for my wife. And I've always enjoyed going out around Portland on my own and see where the night takes me. The Oregon mask mandate ended last weekend, and I only had half a day of work today, so I took the train to Portland with the hankering to play some Sopranos pinball. It's always been one of my favorite machines, partially because it's clever and full of innuendos, but also because I'm usually okay at it. Meaning I can get enough free plays to pass a couple hours only on a few dollars. So I arrive at the first bar, where I normally play the Sopranos, and I buy a beer and hit the head before feeding a couple of dollars into the machine to get started. It's immediately obvious that the machine is in need of maintenance, to the point that using my remaining credits was just a waste of time. I hadn't been out in a long time and was determined to have a good time, so I pounded my beer and opened my pinball app to see if I could find another good machine nearby. I was surprised to see another bar within walking distance that also had a Sopranos. I had never been to this particular spot, so I headed out immediately and doubled time to it. What should have been an 8 to 10 minute walk took over 20, due to a large area that was closed due to road construction, which forced me to go pretty far out of my way. The sun was setting, and there was a huge group of blackbirds or sparrows that were flying around overhead. There were so many, I actually jogged a bit, just to avoid the bird poop that I could hear spattering the road nearby. This second bar was totally worth a walk, and is a really fun spot I plan on going back to. The machine there worked great as well. There's also a guy feeding money into the jukebox, and doing a great job curating everyone's favorite playlist. I ordered my second beer, and asked the bartender where the bathroom is, only to find out that due to a plumbing emergency, it was closed. I had to pee really bad, so I thanked the bartender, paid my tab, and checked the pinball app again to see where else I could find nearby. I was completely surprised to see another nearby bar that I thought permanently closed back when it was in business. And sure enough, they had a Sopranos machine too. Thankfully, this bar was a lot closer to the second bar than the second was to the first, and I make a really good time getting there. This third bar is packed and has great energy. I use the restroom and head back to the bar to get a beer, before I walk through the crowd to get to the isolated small arcade in a room adjacent to the bar. I was ecstatic to find myself in a completely empty room containing a nearly mint condition Sopranos machine. I'm a couple drinks into my first game when a younger guy in his 20s or early 30s walks in and asks if I want to play doubles on the next game. I excitedly agree because I hadn't had the chance to play against someone in quite a while. I honestly don't remember his name, but I introduce myself and he starts talking to me about how he was from New York and felt like everyone spends way too much time on their cell phones. The world is going into hell rant, you know the one. He seemed depressed and in need of some kind of direction or guidance, which I wasn't going to judge about, as I was pretty much the same when I was his age. I tried to engage him and brought up some examples from history where technology shook things up, but ultimately improved things on a global scale after some time. I asked him what brought him to Portland from New York, and that's when the conversation took a turn. He became really evasive and made some comments about Portland just being as bad as New York. I grabbed a drink of my beer and started playing again to distract myself from the odd energy he was giving off. And that's when he really freaked me out by letting me know that he had been following me from the first bar that I went to that night. At first, I really didn't even think about what he was saying, until he talked about how crazy it was when those birds were flying over our heads. Even though he was pursuing me without my knowledge at this time. He also described getting into an altercation with the bartenders at the second bar, which is just as crazy because both bartenders had been seriously polite and apologetic about the bathrooms being out of order. The pinball machine in that bar gave me a full view of the bar itself, so I would have seen any such altercation if it actually happened while I was there. So what he was describing must have happened after I left. He's still talking as I'm playing at this point, going on and on like we're really close friends or something. I start checking myself and patting myself down to make sure I have all my stuff on me so I can leave as soon as my ball drains. I grab my jacket the moment the ball drops, give the guy a firm and quick pat on the shoulder, and walk back to the bar and the crowd as quickly as possible, before triple timing it back to the train station, taking as many turns as I could along the way. I made it to the train without incident, but the encounter has sat oddly with me ever since. So, Mr. Everyone used their cell phone too much from New York, let's not meet ever again, and stay away from my Sopranos pinball. Hey everyone, thanks for listening if you stuck around at this point. If you haven't yet, please hit the like button, the subscribe button, and that notification bell to be notified when future episodes come out. You can stalk me on Twitter, you can stalk me on Facebook, and you can also stalk me on Instagram. If you have a true scary story of your own, feel free to send it to my email, or post it to my subreddit. All these links are below. What's up YouTube? It's your boy. Make sure you hit that fucking like button. No, I'm not doing that. Just kidding. For real, make sure you check out Bad Vibes. Cool fucking dude. Very chill dude, very funny dude, very easy to get along with. Also had me on his channel very early on whenever I first started out, so I really greatly appreciate that he did that. So I know this ain't much, but I'd like to return the favor, just give him a shout out. For some reason you're not subbed to him, please go sub to him, go show him some love and some appreciation either on his channel or in the comments below. I'm not entirely sure when the next episode's going to come out. Probably within the next few days I'll start working on it, and then it'll be out some point after that. I don't know. It's getting really nice out, so I'm wanting to be outside, and I will obviously continue to make episodes, but it's once, like I said, once the weather gets nicer, it's a lot harder to keep me inside. So we'll see how it goes, and I'll I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.